Welcome to Underwire History. The Tianqi era begins in Ming Dynasty China, 6 months after Zhu Changluo becomes the Taichang emperor, unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. The Taichang emperor's short tenure is marked by escalating pressures on the Ming dynasty. A series of droughts and crop failures have left many provinces struggling to feed their populations. As the harvest season approaches, the empire faces a critical decision: allocate scarce resources to alleviate suffering or maintain military readiness against potential threats. The strain on local authorities has reached a breaking point, with some officials forced to choose between competing demands for aid from different regions and factions within the government. This is further complicated by the Taichang emperor's own inexperience and the power vacuum left by his predecessor's sudden death. Zhu Changluo's authority is still being consolidated when he faces a major crisis: the threat of Manchu incursions from the north, which has been brewing for years but has yet to be fully addressed. The situation becomes increasingly precarious as the empire's financial reserves dwindle and its military defenses begin to weaken. Underlying these immediate challenges are deeper structural issues within the Ming dynasty, including a declining population and an over-reliance on outdated administrative systems that fail to keep pace with the changing demands of governance. The Tianqi era begins in Ming Dynasty China, 6 months after Zhu Changluo becomes the Taichang emperor. The transition marks a critical juncture for the empire, as the new ruler must navigate the consequences of his predecessor's death and address the mounting pressures that have been building since then. With the harvest season approaching, the need to allocate resources effectively takes on added urgency, particularly in light of the ongoing droughts and crop failures that have left many provinces struggling to feed their populations. The situation is further complicated by Zhu Changluo's own inexperience, which leaves him without the strong foundation of leadership that his predecessor had built up over time. As he seeks to consolidate his authority, he faces a major crisis. The threat of Manchu incursions from the north has finally reached a critical mass and demands immediate attention. The empire's financial reserves are dwindling, its military defenses are weakening, and the underlying structural issues within the Ming dynasty, including a declining population and outdated administrative systems, are beginning to show their full effects. With the stakes higher than ever before, Zhu Changluo must make a series of difficult decisions that will shape not just his own reign but the very fate of the empire. As the Tianqi era begins, the weight of these challenges falls squarely on Zhu Changluo's shoulders. The financial strain caused by repeated droughts and crop failures has left the imperial treasury depleted, exacerbating the already precarious situation. With limited resources at his disposal, Zhu Changluo must balance competing demands for relief from various provinces, while also addressing the pressing threat of Manchu incursions from the north. The pressure to allocate resources effectively is further complicated by the need to maintain domestic stability and prevent popular discontent from boiling over into full-blown rebellion. To compound matters, Zhu Changluo faces significant pushback from within the imperial court itself, as various factions vie for influence and power in the wake of his predecessor's death. The consequences of these institutional dynamics are far-reaching, shaping not just governance but also the very fabric of Ming dynasty society. In the face of such adversity, Zhu Changluo must rely on his own judgment to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that define imperial politics at this time. His decisions will have a lasting impact on the empire's fortunes, influencing everything from economic growth to social stability in the years to come. The Tianqi era begins under Zhu Changluo with a sense of urgency and foreboding. The weight of his predecessor's legacy hangs over him, as does the threat of Manchu incursions from the north, which has finally reached a critical mass. With the empire's financial reserves dwindling and its military defenses weakening, Zhu Changluo faces impossible choices between competing demands for relief and resources. The structural issues that have been festering within the Ming dynasty, including a declining population and outdated administrative systems, now threaten to overwhelm the new emperor. In this precarious situation, the very survival of the empire hangs in the balance. The economic stagnation that has plagued the Ming dynasty for decades is a direct result of Zhu Dai's failed reforms. Despite his predecessors' attempts to stimulate growth through tax breaks and infrastructure investment, the economy remains sluggish, with widespread poverty and unemployment on the rise. Zhu Changluo inherits an imperial treasury with a depleted coffers, forcing him to choose between investing in economic development or allocating resources towards bolstering the military against the encroaching Manchu forces. The pressure from within the court is compounded by external threats, as regional warlords begin to assert their own authority, further eroding central control and emboldening border tribes like the Mongols and Tibetans to test Ming defenses. The consequences of these factors on the fabric of society are already being felt, with peasants and artisans fleeing rural areas for cities, only to find overcrowding, poor living conditions, and scarce job opportunities waiting them there. As the emperor grapples with these myriad challenges, he must also contend with the growing influence of eunuchs within the imperial court, who often prioritize their own interests over those of the empire's well-being. The burden of his predecessor's legacy weighs heavily on Zhu Changluo as he navigates the treacherous landscape of a weakening Ming dynasty. As the emperor grapples with internal conflicts and external threats, the economy teeters on the brink of collapse, with widespread poverty and unemployment pushing peasants and artisans to abandon rural areas for overcrowded cities. The economic stagnation has led to increased taxation, further crippling the already weak economy. Regional warlords have begun to form alliances with each other, threatening to break away from central control. The eunuchs within the imperial court have formed a powerful faction, using their influence to shape policy and line their own pockets. Peasants and artisans are being forced to take on debt to survive, as the scarcity of jobs and rising costs of living leave them with little choice. Zhu Changluo's government is under pressure from within and without, as regional officials begin to assert their own authority and border tribes like the Mongols and Tibetans test Ming defenses. The decline in population has led to a shortage of skilled laborers, exacerbating the economic crisis. As resources become increasingly scarce, the competition for power among different factions within the court becomes more intense, with some eunuchs advocating for radical reforms while others push for increased military spending. Despite his efforts to address the crisis, Zhu Changluo's popularity is waning among the people, who are growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress and the seeming inability of the government to get a handle on the situation. As Zhu Changluo grapples with these internal challenges, he faces external pressures from neighboring countries. The Japanese have been expanding their territory in Korea and Manchuria, increasing tensions along the northern border. Zhu's advisors urge him to strengthen military defenses, but this comes at a high cost, further straining an already overburdened economy. He is forced to choose between investing in infrastructure projects or allocating more funds for defense, a decision that will have far-reaching consequences. One faction within the court advocates for an alliance with the Japanese, hoping to use their influence to counterbalance growing regional powerhouses like the Mongols. However, this proposal sparks resistance from other eunuchs who argue it would undermine Ming authority and create long-term liabilities. The debate over foreign policy becomes increasingly acrimonious as tensions between rival factions escalate. One of Zhu's advisors, a seasoned diplomat named Wei Guoquan, suggests a different approach, a combination of military modernization and economic reforms to boost trade with neighboring countries and stimulate growth within the empire. But the path forward is fraught with obstacles. Corruption, factionalism, and regional warlords make any solution difficult to implement. A severe drought hits the empire's wheat belt, exacerbating food shortages and further straining an already fragile economy. Zhu must balance competing demands from his advisors and navigate treacherous internal politics as he struggles to find a way out of this crisis. As resources dwindle and power brokers maneuver for position, Zhu Changluo becomes increasingly isolated, surrounded by sycophants and courtiers who prioritize their own interests over the needs of the empire. The drought's impact on agriculture is particularly devastating, with crop yields plummeting by as much as 50% in some regions. Food prices skyrocket, leaving millions struggling to make ends meet. Zhu's advisors continue to squabble among themselves, each pushing their own agenda while the emperor remains uncertain about which path to take. The faction advocating for an alliance with Japan gains traction, but Wei Guoquan's alternative plan begins to win over some influential eunuchs who see the potential benefits of a more measured approach. However, opposition from hardline militarists and regional warlords proves relentless, forcing Zhu to walk a narrow tightrope between competing interests. Reports begin to surface about widespread famine and starvation in certain provinces, prompting desperate pleas for relief from local officials and villagers. A delegation of high-ranking eunuchs is dispatched to negotiate with the Japanese, while Zhu's economic advisors push for austerity measures to stem the empire's hemorrhaging finances. Regional warlords capitalize on the power vacuum, launching small-scale rebellions and skirmishes that further destabilize the already fragile regional balance of power. As resources dwindle and instability mounts, Zhu Changluo becomes increasingly reliant on his most trusted advisor, Wei Guoquan, who helps him navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. The once mighty empire teeters on the brink of collapse as internal strife, economic woes, and external pressures converge to create a perfect storm of crisis. The drought that ravaged the empire's agricultural heartland was not just a natural disaster, but also a symptom of deeper structural issues. The empire's once vibrant irrigation systems, built during the Tang dynasty, had fallen into disrepair due to years of neglect and mismanagement. Local officials, tasked with overseeing these critical infrastructure projects, were often more concerned with lining their own pockets than addressing the needs of their constituents. The impact was exacerbated by the empire's rigid hierarchical system, which stifled innovation and discouraged risk-taking among its bureaucrats. Agricultural specialists, who had long been at odds with traditionalist elements within the imperial administration, saw their efforts to modernize and adapt farming practices repeatedly stymied by entrenched interests and bureaucratic inertia. In this context, Zhu Changluo's increasingly erratic decision-making was a product of his own isolation and reliance on sycophantic advisors who prioritized their own advancement over the welfare of the empire. The hardline militarists and regional warlords who opposed Wei Guoquan's alternative plan were driven by a desire to exploit the power vacuum and consolidate their own positions, rather than genuinely address the empire's pressing challenges. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.